of our largest programs, One Day at a Time, led by the dynamic Mel Wells, was founded by his father in the late 80s to address the burgeoning problem of drug use and HIV/AIDS. And how do you deal with drug addiction, homelessness, and illness, right? And so he started a program that became the beginning of what we call now the Recovery House. And so now, today, 40 years later, ODAT serves 57,000 people every year. They have a whole slate of drug and alcohol treatment programs, mental health programs, reentry programs, employment programs, illness management programs. They've got all kinds of things. And that's just one of our 60 programs. So I think that when we get behind solving community problems, we can find leaders who are really ready to step up to the plate.
All right, guys, welcome back to a brand new episode of the Heart and Hustle podcast. Now, I'm incredibly excited because we have an amazing leader here today who specializes in supporting the nonprofit sector. Now, today is going to be an amazing story because we're going to talk about not only his personal journey, what's impacting nonprofits today, how they're looking at technology, some of the challenges that they're facing, but also just the landscape of how this space is evolving. Once again, thank you so much for coming to the show today, man. Arun, welcome, man. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Keenan, it's such a pleasure. Thank you. And I'm excited to be here. Really appreciate the time.
One of the questions that I think is really important for us to kind of dive in and it'll kind of set the table for our entire episode is, are we really doing everything the right way in the nonprofit sector? What do you think, man?
I think it's tough to say yes to that. I think that nonprofits do a lot of good work. Their caring business is amazing and people pour their hearts and souls out every day. I think there's a lot of things that are inefficient in the nonprofit sector, and whether it comes all the rules from the government or how underinvestment has impacted the viability of the sector or technology. There's so many things that we could do better, and I think it's really important people think, wow, we're solving society's biggest problems with one of the most under-resourced and underinvested sectors in the country. So what do we need to do if we really want to solve these problems to get it right?
How do you think we got here? Solving some of society's biggest problems with the most underfunded sectors and underutilized resource areas of our business sectors in the United States. What do you think? How do you think we got here?
I think the short answer is this has been a long history of getting here, that charitable efforts weren't viewed as a center of innovation. They were really viewed as managing the downside of a changing society, especially during the second wave of industrialism. And when people started to generate a lot of wealth, they saw people suffering in poverty, but they didn't put the pieces together that how we do what we do in society either creates or reduces poverty. I think they just saw there's poor people and they wanted to help. And so this idea that poor people need charity rather than human beings in a society that develops humanity would organize itself a little differently, so then the charity model really takes place and people start to form a society around making lots of money and then giving out some of it to help with some of the challenges that the society faces. So I think that, not blaming anyone here, casting no aspersions, but I think if we're looking at what does it take for humanity to do well in the next century, we're going to have to solve that problem as a problem on its own, not just a byproduct of how it takes for some people to do well.
As the president of the Urban Affairs Coalition, what are you kind of thinking about what we need to do differently moving into 2025 and beyond to have the impact that we're kind of talking about here?
Sure. And so first, the Urban Affairs Coalition is the largest and oldest fiscal sponsor in the country, led by Black and brown folks. A fiscal sponsor is a larger organization that takes on the legal, financial, and administrative responsibilities for a smaller organization and helps them deliver programming in a cost-effective way. Typically, for a smaller program, that might cut their overhead and their expenses on administrative work by half because there's somebody doing the accounting, the HR, the financial statements, filing the insurance certifications, and whatnot. So, fiscal sponsorship as a way to aggregate nonprofit effort is a way to do what many of the corporations did in the 90s and 2000s, which is use shared services to get cost savings and improve quality. And so many of the biggest fiscal sponsors in the country operate, anywhere between 60 to 100 to thousands of programs. And they help those folks keep the costs down and expand their impact by pushing more money to the bottom line.
Is it easy to say that without these shared services like we're talking about, the nonprofit sector would be even more trouble than they're actually kind of in now because they don't have the resources nor the talent to be able to, I would say, execute on these areas of concern like you guys are talking about
Well,
efficiently?
I think that the reality is the nonprofit sector, 99% of people in the nonprofit sector aren't using a very uh, aren't using a fiscal sponsor. They're kind of running it as we've always run things, which is a chip off the old block model, right? The corporate model, chip it off, that becomes the nonprofit model rather than thinking, is this the best model for nonprofits to operate under? Which, it's charitable money. So shouldn't we save money on things that, why should everybody have the same, you know, clerk doing the same thing and not all of them working to maximum capacity, right? Like there's just some efficiency questions we have to answer.
Why are you doing this work, man? Out of all the places that you could have applied yourself, right, in all of your knowledge and all of your expertise, why did you think that, being the president of the Urban Affairs Coalition was the best spend of your time? What was like the motivation in doing this work?
First and foremost, I come from a family that was deeply impacted by poverty, and my father grew up in post-colonial India, watched half of his brothers and sisters. He was one of 15, only seven survived, pass away. And so there's always somebody out there, even if I'm doing well right now, my father came to America and was successful. There's always somebody who's exactly like my dad, a kid who was innocent of everything else that was going on in the world, born into a family that would have been, say it's a good family, but they're poor, you know? And so we have an obligation, like somebody took the time to make sure that my father got educated and he made a successful life for himself, and he instituted the values that, you just where you're born doesn't mean that you don't have a responsibility collectively to other people. And so, that's been a value I held my whole life. I went through Jesuit school and they taught you to be a man for others and live a life of service. I grew up, I've done service work my entire life for the most part, whether it was in government or in nonprofits or even at corporate. I always focused on trying to be a person who is serving others through leadership. And UAC is a perfect place for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting how like our early experiences, especially with kind of the role models in our family, teach us to serve others. And I feel like we've gotten away from that a lot in our society today. But hearing kind of the origin story of the tragedy of your father only being one of the seven surviving of 15, and then diving into this work is just so important. I just think that we need to be more servitude today in society. And I'm glad that we have leaders like you who are kind of really pioneering and thinking about how we can support these organizations in our community because they need more support than ever from the lens looking on kind of the work that these organizations do.
That's right. I think it's hard for people to understand how many challenges that their neighbors and other fellow residents wherever they live are facing. I think we're really good at um, I heard a vet say cats are good at masking the pain, and I'd like them to think about human beings. Human beings are really good at masking the pain and putting on a good face and keeping it moving when in reality, a lot of people are really struggling.
So I know that, you guys at the UAC have been supporting organizations for 55 years now across mental health, reentry, entrepreneurship, homelessness, and community services. Why are these specific service areas that you guys are focusing on? Is that the highest need right now across the demographic of organizations you guys support, or how did you guys come to that?
It's a little bit more organic than that. We're always looking to address the issues that are emerging in communities, the ones that there aren't really good solutions for. And so, a lot of times many of the programs we have long histories of evolving into these things. So, for example, one of our largest programs, One Day at a Time, led by the dynamic Mel Wells, was founded by his father in the late 80s to address the burgeoning problem of drug use and HIV/AIDS. And how do you deal with drug addiction, homelessness, and illness, right? And so he started a program that became the beginning of what we call now the recovery house movement in the world. He was the first person to call it a recovery house and kind of propagate that model. So I think that when you're looking at that, that growing need, I mean, crack was not a problem in the 70s, right? But in the 80s and 90s and continuing on to today, wide scale, substance use disorder is out there. And so we try to stay in those spaces and make those time and energy investments to get outcomes. And so now, today, 40 years later, ODAT serves 57,000 people every year. They have a whole slate of drug and alcohol treatment programs, mental health programs, reentry programs, employment programs, illness management programs. They've got all kinds of things. And that's just one of our 60 programs. So I think that when we get behind solving community problems, we can find leaders who are really ready to step up to the plate.
And what do you think, from the macro societal challenges of mental health and substance use and everything else that we're facing, why do you think we continue? Maybe this is kind of, a little bit of a left field question. Why do you think the needs in our communities continue to grow, but reimbursement rates and things like that continue to get cut from like an insurance payer perspective? That puts an incredible amount of stress on these type of organizations to meet the demand.
Sure. And then the costs don't stay fixed either. So, there's a combination of challenges when costs rise and there's cuts, and you still have to provide the same services, if not more, to people who are now becoming more acutely aware of how mental health has impacted them. I think that that's a big area. For example, shortly after the pandemic, it was really clear that the nonprofit sector and clinicians generally didn't have enough therapists to meet that demand. So I think that there are those growing challenges as times change and needs change. We got to stay on top of it. And then also we have to create humanistic frameworks so that we can keep people in care. It's hard enough to find somebody who needs help. It's just as hard to keep them getting that help and then have the good outcomes. So we want to really support programming, organizations, so they can support individuals in their personal success.
What does that humanistic framework mean? I want to double click on that because that's really important. We think about the long tail, I would say, continuation of services needed, especially when it comes to mental health and substance use and addiction treatment, everything else like that. These are long time horizons. And so is that why you're saying it's difficult to keep somebody engaged for that long to get the outcomes that we're talking about?
Yeah. When I go back to my own career and I see what my arc was, I started the city's first drop-in center for kids who are doing who are doing sex for money for drugs 24/7. And, occasionally I might run into one of those young people and either they've gotten clean or they're still on the street. When I met them, they were 18, and that was close to 20 years ago. Now they're 38. That's a very different story. And so the first step is just helping them stay alive. But then the second step is staying with them long enough to get them the help when they need it, because you can't really make somebody stop using drugs.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can't make somebody's leg get better unless they want it to get better. Any of these things really require partnership, cooperation, respect, caring, concern. And I think that there's a lot of work we have to do to see that, people who aren't succeeding in our society the way it's structured right now, probably could succeed at something else. They're not people to be, when we talk about a humanistic framework, we don't want to just think about people as either producing or not producing, therefore having value or not having value. We want to operate from a humanistic viewpoint where everybody has value and that we have to provide the structure to be able to kind of cultivate it. And at least in human services work, that there's a lot of potential for recovery and redemption, and that's the basis on which we want to do that work.
Doesn't your intuition tell you that we need to swing back towards that humanistic framework rather than either you're a valuable person in society by producing, you're a non-valuable person in society by not producing? It seems like we need to swing back in the opposite direction, more so now than ever.
I think so. I think that that part of the challenge for people in the culture that we have right now is, things are changing quickly. What whole groups of people used to do just in the last year became all AI, right? There's going to be a lot more changes. So valuing people um, makes a lot of sense. And creating structures for people to be able to bring higher level engagement, creativity, and curiosity to the table. Because we don't live in an industrial world anymore. Most people aren't producing widgets. At the same time, we are still in the period where we don't know what the next economy is going to really look like. So we do have an opportunity to get people at least ready for the things we know are going to be important, instead of letting them stay stuck at the things that may not be relevant in 5 years.
How do you think we're going to be able to do that? Because when you're talking here, my gears are running in my head where I'm thinking about with AI, everybody thinks about productivity. We think about the things that we can produce quicker, faster. But yet we have so many people in our society who aren't ready for that large chasm jump into that productivity based society. And it seems like you said, we're waiting for the new element of the horizon to kind of show itself. And it seems like we're kind of like in a limbo period, which is really interesting to me.
Yeah, I think that in part there's a lot of things that aren't being done in society. Like, there is room for jobs programs. There's room for people to get trained on how to do some of these things. And I think the challenges for, like I look in Philadelphia and I see how Philadelphia operates. One of the things is the people who want the help and the people who can help are never in the same place. So there's a lot of bridge building that we need to do. People looking for work, if they're not connected, it's hard to find. People who are connected looking for work find jobs within 3 to 6 months. So I think that there's some breaking down our old silos, our old groups, reconnecting people in ways that are more equitable and kind of humanistic, and then starting to think about what it's going to take on a much smaller unit. Your neighborhood, your church, your community, your block. Um, what can we do on our own pedal power to get people connected to things that I have? Right?
Why do you think everything is so siloed? That's really interesting to me because we all participate in this nonprofit sector, right? We're all getting dollars from the government normally, or we're fundraising to be able to serve the community, but there's so much siloing that happens when it comes to workforce and the people who actually need it. Why do you think we see so much of that compartmentalization at those lower levels?
Well, I have a theory, and I don't proffer this as a scientific theory. I just would say it seems to me that the way that things work is that people who have access um, have a lot of access, and the people who don't have access don't even know where to start.
Mm-hmm.
So, in a lot of these, like how networks operate, you see that the network is really around the people who are already working, already going to places, already doing certain things, and the people who need help are not connected to those things, right? And so what we talk about is like credible messengers that are trusted individuals who can help share those messages to try to connect people. But that's kind of a level of community work and community organizing, community, building that I think that could help accelerate. And that doesn't take a lot of money. It just takes consistent effort. So I think that's one like low cost solution that people could have is integrate more information sharing about the resources you're available with, you have available to you, to the people that you're connected with in your regular communications.
Here's an interesting concept, and I kind of want to riff on this. In the world that we live in today, everything is based on convenience. It seems like all information flows towards us. But often when we're looking for housing, we're looking for workforce, we're looking for all these type of things, right? If you don't know where to look, those information pieces aren't coming towards you, but you have to go out and search for them. Do you think that the layer of convenience in society today is often stopping people from reaching out and going to explore and find resources? Because there's like a fallacy of you build it, they will come, which I'm kind of hearing here, which doesn't seem to be true.
Right. Well, and I also think that people who are inclined to try to find things easily are probably, as the internet gets easier to use and things are easier to find, are probably feeling much more frustrated than the old kind of grind it out model, because it becomes when you have a certain expectation that everything should show up to you within a couple clicks,
Hmm.
it may be a few more clicks further and you may not know, right? So really having people, helping people navigate those resources, having people, you know, connect intentionally those networks and kind of weave them together a little bit becomes really crucial. That becomes a whole job, is network management and making sure that your network is getting the resources that it wants. And it means a lot of listening to communities too.
I mean, that in itself is a form of innovation, right? Being able to have the resources necessary to gather the sentiment analysis of the community that you're serving and being able to respond to it. But it seems like with all the pressure from a financial perspective, from a staffing perspective, from a community services perspective, it doesn't seem like these nonprofits often have the time or the bandwidth to innovate because there's so much under pressure in getting to the next funding raise or the next grant dollar to be able to keep the doors open.
Yeah.
So
And
do they even have time to innovate and think creatively about how to solve these problems?
I think that many really struggle with that. I think that there's always time to innovate, but you have to be in a mind space to do that. And then you have to have, and innovation has to be something relevant to your area. And so in some of the sectors, we're really clamped down. Like you have this, if you're going to provide this service, you have to follow this model, you have to do this thing, you have to do that thing. And if you don't do these things, then you don't get paid the full rate for it. So there's a lot of barriers to innovation, inhibitors of innovation in the field. And I do think that the health and wellness of the field in general is a big one. A lot of people are pretty burnt out, pretty stressed out, and they're seeing a lot of primary, secondary, and tertiary trauma from other people. And I don't think there's a lot of vents for it.
I agree. I mean, I think about the role of you having to show up every single day, serving your community, investing your emotional time, your energy into serving others. But then it seems like the problem continues to compound because there's more and more people who are looking for your services every day. You guys are kind of in a place where you're trapped or you have golden handcuffs because you have to serve, and we can't take a step back because the demand is consistently there. It just seems like a rock and a hard place to be stuck between.
Yeah, and it's even, I think that you've captured that well, but it's harder than even you describe or people probably might imagine. For organizations that work with government funding, oftentimes, we don't see the money for a long time. So even when it's a simple premise that I would do work for the government and I would get paid back. What really happens is we do work for the government and then we wait forever to get paid back.
Right.
So that adds another layer of complexity to it, and interest costs, and strain and stress, and making payroll, all those things. It doesn't matter what size of an organization you are in this country as a nonprofit. Those are not unfamiliar struggles.
So, how are our leaders supposed to navigate these times? If you were to sit down with a board of CEOs and leaders from nonprofits, how would you be telling them to strategically think about 2025 and tackling some of these challenges? Do you have any 2 cents on that?
Well, I think the landscape's going to change dramatically with the change in administration. So you should expect, however people believe funding is going to flow, to change, right, in light of a new presidential administration's priorities. I think in particular that'll have some pretty significant impact on programs that have started to look forward to, different diversity, equity, and inclusion programming. I think that seems to be under attack, at least by some. I think that there's probably going to be some concern around programming for folks who are considered immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
And there might be some tensions around those things. And I think that those areas of funding that where people may have received funding from the Biden administration may shrink or dry up in favor of funding to other things. So there will be some federal structural change. And then we have changes in the state legislatures. And so that'll vary on a case-by-case basis. There were a lot of state legislatures that either flipped parties or have a new governor, new senators, or their general assembly may have changed. So I think that those are really on a case-by-case basis, depending on where you are in the country and the mood of the country generally. So I would suspect nonprofits um, may find themselves in a changing time and hard to get settled again.
Man, it sounds like a great reset is what we're kind of hearing from, your outlook on how we're going to navigate the next 4 years.
I think a big reset, I may not be great, because I think a lot of the social pressures that people are facing really do require some bipartisan approaches, and we're having a lot of partisan conversations in America. So there is no reason why we couldn't solve some of the problems if people could work more collaboratively and closely together and focus on the facts of what's happening on the ground rather than the politics of what's happening in these exalted chambers.
I was talking to another CEO from a United Way organization in Tennessee, and we were talking about a seat at the table. Now, one of the things that this CEO was talking about was, often when we think about collaboration, we think we should all come to the table and everybody should have a seat. But often when it comes to funding in the table, if you will, each person has their chunk of the pie. So if somebody else comes to the table, that means I'm going to have to give up part of my pie for this person to slide in. And it seems like even the funding mechanisms and the stability that comes from government dollars and grants and things like that almost stifles collaboration because we're trying to protect ours rather than trying to bring the entire community into a conversation. There's just not enough funding to go around. What do you think about
Right.
that?
Well, I think that's true in some sense, and I would totally see why somebody who maybe worked on the ground and did not receive that funding would think that.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, I think the government also makes, by virtue of its rules and terms and conditions, it makes very specific requirements of organizations to get that funding. And that's something that people learn, not it's not like a back of a cereal box instructions. It's very complicated, and it can prove to be very challenging to keep up with all of those things if you're not familiar with them. So, in many ways, you always have this people who are on the inside get more, and people who are on the outside get less dynamic. And it does seem as though people try to keep others out so that they can keep the money for themselves. The reality is nonprofits aren't the generators of resources, they're the recipients of resources. And so I do think that there's a combination of things that government can do better to get more money down to the ground. I think personally, using what we call financial intermediaries or agencies that are able to move money more quickly to the ground and have better connections in certain communities is a strong practice. For example, if I'm an organization that has a network of 300 or 400 groups and I have good sense of them, then you might say which five would do a good job at gun violence or, mural painting. And we could send out the applications to all of them, but just know that, there are 5 or 6 that really specialize that. So everybody's got a fair shot if they want to take a crack at it. But, if you see these 5 people show up and say, hey, this is what I do every day, don't be surprised. Right.
That's really interesting to me because, one of the things that we talked about in our previous conversation was the data that we're all sharing within institutions, right? If you think about impact, often we look at a specific data set, but that might be telling the entire story, right? And so how do you think about the shared data across the sector of nonprofits and being able to kind of truly measure the impact that each of us is having and then the collective overall?
Yeah, I think that we're not there yet, right? I think um, there's some types of work where people collect really good data and it tells us a lot. There's other kind of work that it doesn't tell us much, right? And when funders start to emphasize data and outcome and results, that's a good thing. However, when it's not really clear how do you document those things, then people come out with whatever information they have. Best effort, they're trying to tell the truth about it. They're trying to tell the story, but the challenge is we haven't gotten to the point where we know what really really works. And I think sadly we're going to learn that it's not a series of interventions that work. It's really a much more stable structure for people that allows their holistically their problems to be addressed simultaneously instead of saying, hey, look, I know you're homeless and you're hungry and you haven't paid back all these credit cards, but let me tell you about this dental program. I think that kind of a mentality just is one that says, hey, this is the only thing I can help you with, so we're going to talk about that, rather than like, what do you need and how can I help you with that? And I think that again is, we're just far away from getting the kind of data that tells us something that we know to be true in individuals. What we have is data that tells us some trends in the aggregate, and I think we got to keep using that extremely well. And I think some organizations really use data extremely well. But I think in general, the kind of question of like, what's the most impactful program, or like those kinds of things, I think that's still a science in the making, not a science that's been made.
Are you excited about the role of artificial intelligence and being able to understand all these macro trends of data and then solidify them down into best practices, or do you think that's still on the horizon?
I think that you know that might take some time, in the sense that I think AI can be really good at helping us kind of dump a big data set and kind of pull out some trends that a normal human can't identify. Um, I still think that, when we're missing some of the fun, like, so for example, when we look at youth, wherever you go in the world, the research shows that, and it's going to sound super obvious, caring adults, safe place. Those are the two most important things to a youth program. It's not curriculum, it's not staffing. It's that, do you have one person you trust, and do you feel safe when you go there? Right? Whether you're in Israel, you're in Windsor, Canada, you're in, Lima, Peru, that's what kids need and want. Right? So as long as we don't do those things well, I think we'll have a lot of bells and whistles and metrics and things, but we got to really focus on fundamentals, and then AI can really help us once we kind of get a grounding in, like, it's not, I don't know how helpful something is if we're not willing to do the basics. Once we're willing to do the basics, I think that then all of a sudden that's a form of discipline that will help us do advanced things. If we're looking for a quick fix, then AI will tell somebody something, they can get funded for it, and they'll have a quick fix, and 3 years later we'll still be here. You know what I mean?
Mm. Yeah, it seems like we've got a lot of like band-aid approaches to these macro societal problems that take a longer time horizon to be able to solve. And I do worry about some of the conversations when I hear the evangelist on the early adoption wave of AI saying that this is going to be the solution for everything. It's not so much a silver bullet, but 100 golden BBs that we need to shoot at these problems to be able to have a bigger sustainable impact. Because I just don't think that the switch of a new technology is going to kind of transform the macro societal issues that we're kind of facing right now.
Well, and also, let's be honest. I mean, technology is useful. It's a tool. It's great. It still has to be something where we're investing in communities, not extracting from them. So, like, if I'm selling somebody some data model or some app on the hope that they'll use it and their utilization will help them improve their lives, I might have helped some people, but still my motive is not to help them, it's to help them while I make money. And therefore it doesn't really matter if I help every single person I touch. It just matters that I have enough subscribers and some of them get help, that we can keep it all moving. And so I just think that the models of investment versus extraction have to be examined. I think the models of quick fixes or like band-aid approaches versus holistic community building approaches have to be examined. And I think that our intentions for how do we how like are we applying the rule that I want somebody to solve this problem so I don't have to live in this world anymore, and are we flipping it now, I'm going to solve this problem so that nobody in the world has to live with it, or am I just solving it to make money, which is that's the way we live in America. And I get that people sell burgers to make money, they help people to make money. But I think that we have to examine those things, and in examining them we might get better at doing things, even if we're still doing them for reasons that may not be every saint in the Bible's reason, right?
If you had to call your shot for what the next, let's say, 5 years of this nonprofit sector looks like, from the advancement of services, from funding, from the implementation of technology, how would you call your shot, and how you hope the next 5 year kind of unveils itself?
How would I hope it unveils
Yeah,
itself?
let's get super hopeful with this kind of
Yeah, I
projection.
would I would hope that people would start to see investments in the sector as being significant investments to make, right? So that, one is at least the organizations get enough money to do what they need to do, even if it isn't like a lot, but not way below. I think the second thing is a lot of the technology pieces should be coming together, and some of the data, a lot of organizations struggle with data collection, and that automating some of the data collection and getting better systems to process that data that produce some trends, some perspective, some insight could really help drive innovation. And I think I'm excited about the younger generation of people who are now moving, like millennials and Gen Z, moving into the market for nonprofit services. I think that, there's a generation of people who are leaving now, and there will be a generation of people replacing them, in many ways, that are tuned way in to their daily lives because, Gen X is a really small generation, and then boomers are left. So very quickly, you'll see the majority of people who are either getting served or providing services in nonprofits are millennials and Gen Zs. So I think that time, that younger generation is really going to come into its fore.
And it seems like that's kind of what we also need is a turning of leadership in no disrespectful way whatsoever. But when you grow up in a world where you're indoctrinated by technology and how it can make services and delivery of, I would say, products easier, you have a different mindset on how we can attack some of these different problems. And it seems like we just need a little bit more time until we can get there to be as efficient in the adoption of technology, but also the curiosity and how this tech can actually help us serve our communities as well.
Yeah, and having people be interested in making technology for communities, right? Because I think that is a specific need that we haven't figured out. Is how do how are people thinking about, like, what would make it less expensive to live in this home, rather than what can I sell somebody, that they're going to buy, right? And so, there are things that do that, by accident. There's things that do it, like, who knew that new windows would make it so much more cost efficient,
Great
right?
example.
But it really does, and I think that people who lived in places with old drafty windows can't deny it. So energy efficiency, solar energy. There's a lot of things we can do together.
Are you hopeful for this next generation of people who are coming into this space to work in the nonprofit sector? Do you think it's kind of a revelation of maybe going into some of these large corporate sectors to just make money, money, money isn't exactly the wave of how this next generation's looking to kind of find fulfillment in the work that they do?
I think this next generation has values that are consistent with helping people,
Mm.
and they've experienced a decrease in the lifestyle as compared to their grandparents. So they have more empathy, for people who maybe, you know, don't have some, lofty goals of getting rich fast and whatnot. But I also think that there's an influencer culture, and there's less access um, to the thinking of the world, So we're used to listening to anybody who can have a microphone, and like, you're doing good things with your microphone, but we know what the content world looks like.
Yeah.
It's anything and everything you could get. And so I think that there's some challenges there, and I also think that people are losing their ability in some ways to have more complex exercises, because, like, not because, like, they're somehow not as smart. People are always as smart as they've ever been. There's something that is hard about having to do school the way we used to do it, and where they don't gamify all the lessons, and, like, I mean, like, there's some pedal power that benefits you. Let me say it that way. And so I get concerned that we're making everything really easy to learn, when actually part of learning is really stretching you, not just like pouring information in. And also, like, we live in a world where you can get everything in your pocket. So how are you going to use that information? What if you just listen to the first thing you see, and the first thing you see is really, really makes no sense or ridiculous, right? Like, then you're just going to run off and with no discernment. I mean, I think there's some challenges out here when you have everything in your pocket.
It's interesting. I'm reading a book right now called Deep Work by an author named Cal Newport. And he talks about the focus element of being able to focus on a task without distraction is becoming the more valuable skill set in the world where information is constantly being forced into you and you don't have the ability to focus on a real problem. I do really worry about that. That's in the front of my mind. So I'm really glad that you brought that up.
Yeah. And people don't even sit down and talk to people without a phone in their hand.
Mm.
Right. So it's, like, even hard to focus on a person, let alone, you know, I think that's right. I think we have to learn how to slow it all down a little bit. It's going too fast.
Yeah. Here's a question for you. One of the traditions that we have on the podcast as we kind of put the wheels down to land it here is our previous guest wanted to ask you a blind question. Now, with all your responsibility, right, of being the president of your organization and helping so many community-based nonprofits, how are you holding space for yourself so you can show up as the best version of yourself to do the work that you do while also modeling that for other people on your team so they can have those boundaries to show up as they can so we don't deal with the nonprofit burnout that we talked about a little bit earlier?
I wish I was doing that better. Some things I've started to do is make sure that when I have a day on the weekend where I don't have anything, I don't do any work. I actually just relax because you need some time for it all to calm down, right? What we started to do is we have generally stopped responding to emails after 5. Even if I respond, I don't send it back until the next day. Like I might, for my style of work, need to just know everything's done before I can chill, and that's fine. But I set it to send in the morning. So it gives people some space where they're not at work. I mean, you spend so much time at work, right? It's the first thing. You get up, you get ready, you go to work, you come home, and it's like almost night. Or if it's not night, then you eat and you go to sleep and you do it again. So at least some time in the evening to, have some boundaries and enjoy your family and friends. And then starting to ask people at work, what would make it happier for you if you were here? I mean, they say some things that you don't even expect, like snack bar. All of a sudden now we got like a million snacks and everybody's like thrilled about it. But like, I would have never thought of that. It just says, hey, somebody thought you're going to be here and you might be hungry. So there's all kinds of things like that.
No, I appreciate that, man. It's just really important. Once again, we talk about the nonprofit sector. One of my favorite analogies here as I look at my coffee cup for everybody who's watching is you can't pour from an empty cup. And we do have to refill our cup in order for us to show up every day, man. So, man, I just want to say thank you for coming on the show. This has been an enlightening conversation. I'm so glad that we have leaders out there that are focusing on how we can help the next generation of nonprofits succeed by having impact, by serving our community, but also having the resources that are necessary to dive in and actually take the time that it's going to take to have the sustainable outcomes that we're looking for, man. And I just want to say for everybody who's tuning and watching, man, I really appreciate you coming on the show. It's been a blessing.
My pleasure. And Keenan, thank you for what you're doing to get the word out.
Absolutely, guys. So that's another episode of the Heart and Hustle podcast. We'll catch you in the next one.